Good evening. My name is Sean Speer, and I belong to a binational household. My oldest was born in the Ottawa area. My youngest is an American citizen, and so as you can imagine, things got a bit intense during the Four Nations Cup earlier this year. I'm going to talk tonight about two recent historical anniversaries in order to engage with tonight's question of sovereignty and my own topic of economic nationalism. The first, 50 years ago, late last month, is the failure of an effort to create an automaker in the province of New Brunswick. Some people here might remember the Bricklin. The Bricklin was, well, the Bricklin didn't ultimately, it failed. It was a catastrophic effort between the government of the Hatfield today and an eccentric, idiosyncratic American millionaire to establish a auto company in the province of New Brunswick. The Bricklin, of course, had sleek gull-wing doors. It looked a lot like the DeLorean, for those who don't remember it. It lasted for about 12 months. There were roughly 3,000 cars that came off the production line, and today are an interest of collector curiosity, but not a durable, sustainable part of the New Brunswick economy. And I think we need to understand the Bricklin in a way as a metaphor for this broader conversation that we're having today about economic nationalism. It's important to note that the Bricklin comes from a particular moment in our history that has a lot of similarities to the one we're facing. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, we were marked by a wave of Canadian economic nationalism. The centennial, of course, had sparked a new pride and a lot of patriotism in the country. The Vietnam War and the Nixon administration's protectionism created distance from the United States. Many were worried that American business and culture were swallowing us whole. So Ottawa and the provinces decided that sovereignty required economic independence, and the government would do what was necessary in order to create and protect Canadian industry and technologies. We subsidize domestic industry. We try to insulate ourselves from global markets. People will be familiar with things like Petro-Canada, the Foreign Investment Review Act, the expansion of the CanCon regulations, so on and so forth. We were in an era of economic nationalism. I think it's fair to say, in hindsight, it was a mostly unsuccessful project. It contributed to the stagflation of the 1970s. It was inefficient and distortionary. One of my favorite quotes of the era is from the late great economist Harry Johnson, who spent about as much time drinking as he did writing, and so he may have been experimenting with something new at the time. But he wrote, quote, "Economic nationalism is diverting Canada into a narrow and garbage-cluttered cul-de-sac," unquote. Now, even if one thinks that may have been alcohol-induced, it's fair to say by the early 1980s there was a growing recognition, even on the part of Pierre Trudeau's government, that something had to change, that these efforts to effectively engineer and protect different parts of Canada's economy represented a downward pressure on investment and employment and so on. And people may remember, which brings me to my second anniversary, the Prime Minister of the day appointed Donald MacDonald, a former cabinet minister, to chair a Royal Commission on the Economic Union and Development Prospects of Canada. His report came out 40 years ago last month. And people, of course, are familiar with the recommendation that Canada pursue free trade with the United States, which, of course, the Mulroney government ultimately did. But it was more fundamental than that. The MacDonald Commission reflected a kind of ethos about the role of markets and the role of government, and the need for Canadians not to feel insecure, but to feel bold and ambitious about our capacity to compete in global markets. There's a famous line in the MacDonald report where he says there are fewer places to hide, and that's okay, because Canada can compete if we open ourselves up to competition within our economy and competition globally. That economic openness, in other words, wasn't a surrender. It was an expression of confidence. And so we saw, I think it's fair to say, one way to understand the past 40 years or so of Canadian political economy is that we have taken steps to rid ourselves of a lot of the vestiges of that last episode of economic nationalism, liberalizing parts of our economy, trying to create fair and open forms of competition, encouraging foreign direct investment from different parts of the world. And yet, in the face of Trump's threat, we seem to be going through an episode of deja vu. Half a century later, a lot of those new ideas are finding salience. The language has changed a bit, but the underlying impulses are the same. We talk about resilience and security and sovereignty. And what's interesting is that while economic nationalism in the 1960s and 70s were principally a progressive political project, they're increasingly conservative ones today, inspired in part by the economic policy program of the Trump administration and center-right governments elsewhere in the Anglo-American world. So it's notable, for instance, that we've seen the Poilievre-led conservatives calling for protection of different parts of Canada's economy, calling on the government to block foreign investments, and so on. And I think this is a mistake. I think we have to keep in mind that sovereignty isn't isolation. It's the freedom to choose in a world that's interdependent. And it seems to me the great success, that what we learned through that experience from the Bricklin to the McDonald Commission report, is that when we open ourselves up to competition, when we reach out into the world, Canadian companies, Canadian industries, Canadian technologies can be successful, that we can compete and win. And so as we face the current threat of the Trump administration, this instinct to turn inward, I think is precisely the wrong reaction. We can't out-Trump Trump. The best we can do is to have the kind of ambition and boldness and self-confidence that marked the 1985 Rome Commission and the decades of policy that ensued thereafter. Thank you so much for having me.